I want to begin with a statement that might seem exaggerated, but I assure you it's backed by evidence. We are watching the economic foundation of a nation experiencing tremendous pressure, not from foreign invasion or natural catastrophe, but from internal contradictions that had been building for decades and are now reaching a tipping point. Let me speak plainly. When 500,000 people flood the streets of Tel Aviv in a single day, when 1 million citizens demonstrate simultaneously across a country of just 10 million, when active duty military pilots publicly criticize their government's approach, when teenagers collectively refuse mandatory military service, when the budget shortfall approaches 7% of GDP while debt increases by 9% in only 2 years, these aren't simply objections to specific policies. These are indicators of a social agreement in the process of falling apart. Israel's circumstances offer us a valuable example of how economic contradictions can evolve into political turmoil. What makes this situation especially educational is that we're not examining a weak nation with fragile institutions. We're looking at one of the world's most technologically sophisticated economies, hosting more NASDAQ listed companies than any nation except the United States and China, with income per person exceeding Britain, Germany, and Canada. Yet this very achievement contains the origins of its present difficulties. Let me walk through the figures, because the figures reveal a reality that political statements cannot hide. The immediate catalyst, naturally, is the conflict. The direct expenses from October 2023 through 2024 surpassed $40 billion. For context, that amounts to roughly 7% of Israel's GDP spent in 18 months. The 3-day military action against Iran alone consumed $1.5 billion. That's nearly 1% of the yearly government budget used up in 72 hours. But here's what's essential to grasp. These represent only the direct expenses. The Bank of Israel has computed war-related expenses through 2025 at $55.6 billion. These numbers don't capture the complete economic disruption. Consumer spending fell by 27%. Imports dropped by 42%. Exports declined by 18%. In the second quarter of 2025, the economy shrank by 3.5% as the conflict with Iran interfered with regular business activity. Israel entered this situation from a position of relative fiscal health. Before October 2023, its debt to GDP proportion was among the most favorable in the industrialized world. Even now, at 69%, it remains better than the United States or the European Union, with Germany as the exception. This context matters. This isn't a narrative of wasteful spending or traditional fiscal irresponsibility. But, and this is vital, you cannot expand your debt to GDP proportion by 9% over 2 years without repercussions. You cannot permit interest and debt payments to absorb an ever-growing portion of the budget without making decisions, hard decisions, politically volatile decisions. The OECD forecasts 3.4% growth for 2025 and 5.5% for 2026. The IMF is less optimistic, predicting 3.2 and 3.6% respectively. But let me draw your attention to what actually occurred in the second quarter of 2025, a 5% contraction. The distance between forecast and actuality should worry us all. Here's the fiscal reality. The deficit reached nearly 7% of GDP in 2024. It has narrowed to 5.3% as of February 2025, but this still exceeds the government's own goal of 4.9%. Tax collections in February dropped by 38% compared to January. This instability alone makes budget forecasting nearly impossible. The central bank anticipates a deficit of 4.7% and a debt to GDP proportion of 69% for 2025. But these forecasts assume no significant intensification of hostilities, continued economic recovery, and successful fiscal tightening. How many of those assumptions feel reliable to you at this moment? Let me now address what I view as the deeper structural challenge, one that existed well before October 2023, but has been dramatically intensified by current events. Israel effectively has two economies functioning within a single nation. This isn't figurative. The evidence shows this with stark clarity. The first economy is the technology sector, 9% of the workforce, world leading venture capital investment as a proportion of GDP, remarkable productivity, global competitiveness. In March 2025, Google purchased the Israeli cybersecurity firm Wiz for $32 billion. In July, Nvidia announced a multi-billion dollar technology campus expansion. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has climbed by more than 80% since the conflict started. This economy is flourishing. The second economy encompasses nearly everyone else, and here the picture is quite different. Let's discuss the ultra-Orthodox community, the Haredim. They currently make up about 10% of the population, but demographic forecasts indicate they will comprise 25% by 2050. The Arab Israeli population is approximately 20% currently and expanding. Here are the employment statistics that should trouble any economist. Roughly half of ultra Orthodox men do not work. They study in religious schools supported by government stipends, spousal earnings, and community assistance. Among Arab women, workforce participation remains substantially below the national average. Now, you might say this reflects cultural values, a matter of religious observance or tradition, and you would be correct. But economics doesn't acknowledge our categories. Economics concerns itself with inputs and outputs, productivity and dependency ratios, tax revenue and benefit payments. The Israel Democracy Institute has estimated a cumulative GDP loss of approximately 10% by 2050, 160 billion shekels in 2023 terms, attributable to low ultra-Orthodox workforce participation. That's 10% of economic production simply not occurring. The Bank of Israel's chief economist calculated that eliminating the employment disparity in the ultra-Orthodox sector could add 0.6% to yearly growth, representing a 22% increase in the baseline growth rate. But the disparity isn't solely about employment. It's about sharing responsibilities in the most concrete sense. Haredi households contribute one-third the income tax, national insurance, and health insurance payments that non-Haredi households contribute. Despite Haredi households being on average 1.5 times larger, the average non-Haredi household pays 4,496 shekels monthly in taxes and government payments. The average Haredi household pays 1,469 shekels. Among OECD nations, Israel ranks second only to the United States in disposable income inequality. 70% of Haredim and 57% of Arab Israelis live below the market income poverty threshold. Even after government assistance, 57% of Haredim and 50% of Arab Israelis remain below the poverty threshold. Now, I want to be precise about something. This isn't a criticism of any community. This is an observation about systemic viability. Because here's the dynamic that should concern us. In a democracy, when one portion of the population carries the overwhelming weight of both military service and tax contributions, while another portion is largely excused from both, you establish conditions for social rupture. And when that excused population is also the fastest expanding demographic in the country, the mathematics become unavoidable. By 2060, the ultra-Orthodox and Arab populations combined will constitute half of Israel's total population. Half. If current employment and workforce participation patterns continue, you're looking at a contracting tax base attempting to support an expanding dependent population while simultaneously financing the military needs of a nation in a hostile regional environment. The Bank of Israel has cautioned explicitly that these demographic patterns will diminish market growth in coming decades. A separate finance ministry report used even more severe language, warning of potential Greek-style bankruptcy if integration of ultra-Orthodox and Arab citizens into the workforce fails. Let me now link this to the third element of the crisis, the cost of living, especially housing. The average home price in Israel reached 2.23 million shekels, approximately $660,000 in the first quarter of 2025. In Tel Aviv, the average is 4.14 million shekels, roughly $1.2 million. These prices have nearly doubled in a decade. For rental markets, the circumstances are equally difficult. In Tel Aviv, A modest three-room apartment now costs approximately 7,000 shekels monthly, roughly $2,000. And this represents the lower end of the market. Young Israelis seeking to purchase must accumulate approximately 840,000 shekels in personal savings, covering down payment, closing costs, taxes, and fees. This represents years of savings for most workers outside the technology sector. The social demonstrations of 2011 began with housing expenses. Now, in 2025, those expenses have skyrocketed while wages for most workers have not kept pace. Mortgage rates above 5% combined with down payments requiring substantial cash have pushed more and more Israelis into the rental market, which drives rents higher, which makes saving for a down payment even more difficult. It's a self reinforcing cycle. The OECD has documented that life in Israel is costly by developed world standards, with restrictive planning regulations and slow urban development pushing up home prices. Product market regulations remain more stringent than in comparable economies, reducing competition and keeping consumer prices elevated. When the price of pasta triggered demonstrations in 2022, when cottage cheese boycotts mobilized thousands in 2011, when the Milky protest went viral in 2014 over chocolate pudding prices, these weren't minor consumer complaints. They were expressions of a broader frustration with an economy that appears tilted against ordinary workers. Now, let me connect these three elements: conflict expenses, structural inequality, and cost of living to what we're observing in the streets. In August 2025, 500,000 people marched in Tel Aviv. Organizers reported 1 million participants nationwide. This was not a single occurrence. In March 2025, more than 100,000 demonstrated across multiple cities. Throughout the summer, tens of thousands protested repeatedly, blocking highways, surrounding government buildings, clashing with police. The magnitude matters, but so does the composition. These aren't fringe groups. University presidents attended demonstrations. More than 1,000 current and former military pilots signed an open letter in April 2025 calling the conflict politically driven rather than security driven. These are the elite units, the most skilled forces, publicly questioning their government's approach. Military refusal is accelerating. There's been what organizers describe as an exponential increase of 16 and 17-year-olds refusing conscription. Roughly 100 circulated an open letter explaining their refusal. Reserve soldiers are increasingly vocal about poor strategy, unclear objectives, and excessive burden on a shrinking pool of those willing to serve. The government's response has been telling. As of July 2024, 1,635 Israelis had been arrested since January 2023, with more than 700 arrests since the conflict began. A 2025 Shin Bet affidavit states that Netanyahu explicitly ordered surveillance of citizens involved in demonstrations. A violence monitoring organization reported 1,536 incidents of violence in 2024, with a majority attributed to police actions. When a government begins arresting hundreds of its own citizens for demonstration, when it orders domestic intelligence services to monitor protesters, when it uses water cannons and stun grenades on crowds waving national flags, these are not the actions of a government confident in its legitimacy. Here's what concerns me most as an economist: the feedback loops. Fiscal pressure leads to budget cuts or tax increases, which increase cost of living, which fuels demonstrations, which creates political instability, which reduces investment, which slows growth, which worsens the fiscal position, which requires more budget cuts or tax increases. This is the cycle that has broken other countries. Demographic patterns reduce the tax base while increasing dependency ratios, which strains public finances, which requires either cutting benefits or raising taxes on working citizens, which increases resentment between communities, which hardens political positions, which makes reform more difficult, which ensures the demographic patterns continue unchecked. Military burden becomes concentrated among a shrinking segment willing to serve, which increases the per person cost of service, which fuels resentment, which increases refusal rates, which further concentrates the burden. Meanwhile, the communities excused from service grow larger, making the political cost of changing the exemption higher. These are not problems that resolve themselves. These are problems that compound until something gives. Let me address the obvious counter-argument. Israel has confronted existential threats since its founding. It has fought multiple wars. It has absorbed waves of immigration. It has built a first world economy from nothing. Why should we believe this situation is different? Three reasons. First, the fiscal arithmetic has changed. Previous conflicts were shorter. The current circumstances are approaching 2 years of sustained high intensity operations across multiple fronts with no clear endpoint. The expenses are not a one time shock that can be absorbed and recovered from, they are continuous, cumulative, and accelerating. Second, the demographic patterns are unprecedented. In previous generations, the ultra Orthodox community was small enough that their non participation in the workforce and military was economically manageable. By 2060, they will be 25% of the population. The mathematics of burden sharing become impossible at that scale. Third, and most importantly, the social contract is deteriorating in a way it hasn't before. Previous demonstration movements, 2011, the 2023 judicial reform protests, eventually subsided. The current demonstrations are sustained, growing, and increasingly assertive. When university presidents march, when elite military units openly dissent, when teenagers refuse conscription en masse, you're looking at a crisis of legitimacy, not merely a crisis of policy. Let me offer a specific data point that encapsulates this. In polls conducted in 2025, a majority of Israelis opposed ending the January ceasefire. A majority wanted negotiations to continue, yet the government returned to conflict. The gap between public preference and government action could not be starker. When citizens believe their government is conducting a conflict not for security but for political survival, when they believe the lives of hostages are being sacrificed for coalition management, when they believe their economic future is being mortgaged to maintain power, this is not a governance problem. This is a legitimacy crisis. And legitimacy crises in democracies create revolutionary pressure. Now, I'm not forecasting civil war in the conventional sense, armed factions fighting for territorial control. Israel's institutions remain strong, its security services are capable, its civil society is resilient. But civil war in a modern democracy doesn't resemble Sarajevo in the 1990 seconds. It resembles a society that can no longer agree on basic facts, basic values, basic distribution of responsibilities and rewards. It resembles half the population believing the government is illegitimate while the other half believes the demonstrators are traitors. It resembles communities that no longer speak the same political language, that no longer consume the same media, that increasingly separate themselves geographically and socially. It resembles a nation where the formal institutions continue to operate while the informal bonds of solidarity, the shared sacrifice, the common purpose, the mutual trust steadily erode. The economic indicators suggest we're already there. When your currency markets show instability despite fundamentally sound monetary policy, that's not an economic signal. It's a confidence signal. When your stock market rises while your population demonstrates, that's not strength, it's division. When international institutions lower your credit rating, not because of your debt levels, but because of your political stability, they're telling you something. Fitch downgraded Israel's credit rating in August 2024. The IMF's latest forecast shows significant downward revisions. The OECD warns repeatedly about the need for fiscal discipline and structural reform. These institutions are diplomatic in their language, but read between the lines. They see a country whose economic path depends on political decisions that appear increasingly unlikely to be made. Because here's the central dilemma. The reforms needed to address these structural problems, integrating ultra Orthodox men into the workforce and military, improving Arab educational outcomes and labor participation, reducing cost of living through deregulation and competition, containing fiscal deficits through spending discipline. All of these reforms are politically explosive. They require breaking longstanding arrangements between religious and secular, between left and right, between communities that have negotiated the terms of coexistence for decades. And they require making these changes during a conflict, during an economic slowdown, during a period of maximum political polarization. The current government depends on ultra Orthodox parties for its majority. Those parties have made clear that conscription of religious students is an absolute limit. They've successfully reversed previous attempts at integration. Meanwhile, the secular middle class that pays the taxes and serves in the military is exhausted, angry, and increasingly convinced the system is stacked against them. This is the political economy trap. The reforms most needed are the reforms most difficult to achieve because the beneficiaries of the current arrangement hold veto power over change. We've seen this pattern in other countries: Italy's north south divide, Belgium's linguistic communities, Spain's regional tensions. But those countries have the advantage of being embedded in the European Union, with external constraints on their policy choices and external support in times of difficulty. Israel has neither. Let me conclude with a scenario that keeps me up at night. Imagine the conflict continues for another year. Direct expenses approach 70 to 80 billion. The deficit remains above 5%. Growth remains weak or negative. The shekel weakens, inflation rises, interest rates stay elevated, demonstrations grow larger and more frequent, more soldiers refuse service, more families emigrate. Brain drain from the technology sector accelerates as engineers and entrepreneurs seek stability elsewhere. International investment slows as geopolitical risk premiums rise. The government, needing to maintain its coalition, cannot reform the ultra Orthodox exemptions. It cannot cut spending meaningfully because much of the spending is untouchable defense, debt service, mandatory transfers. So it raises taxes on the working population. VAT increases, income taxes rise, property taxes grow, the cost of living crisis deepens, more demonstrations, more arrests, more polarization. The secular middle class begins to openly question why they should continue carrying a burden that others refuse. The ultra Orthodox community, feeling attacked, becomes more insular and defensive. Arab citizens, already marginalized, see their economic opportunities shrink further. At some point, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but at some point, enough people decide that the social contract is broken beyond repair. Not because they want confrontation, but because they can no longer see a path to shared prosperity within the existing system. This is how democracies fracture, not with a dramatic event, but with 1,000 small decisions by individuals and families to prioritize their own community's interests over the common good because they no longer believe there is a common good to prioritize. The economic evidence suggests we are further along this path than most observers recognize. The demonstrations aren't just about the hostages or the conflict. They're about a generation of young Israelis who look at housing prices, military service requirements, tax burdens, and political dysfunction and ask themselves, why should I stay? When the people who build your technology sector, who serve in your elite units, who pay the bulk of your taxes, start asking that question seriously, when emigration becomes not a marginal choice but a rational economic decision, you're in crisis. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. Israel's economic fundamentals remain strong, its human capital is extraordinary, its technological capabilities are world class, its entrepreneurial culture is unmatched. With sound policy, this economy could support a prosperous, equitable society. But economics follows from politics, and politics follows from social cohesion. When social cohesion fractures, no amount of GDP growth can substitute for the loss of collective purpose. The question isn't whether Israel will survive as a nation. It almost certainly will. The question is what kind of nation it will become. A prosperous democracy with shared sacrifice and mutual obligation, or a divided society with a wealthy enclave increasingly disconnected from the struggles of everyone else, held together not by common purpose but by fear of alternatives. The economic indicators suggest we are heading toward the latter. And once you're on that trajectory, reversing it becomes exponentially harder with each passing year. I don't offer easy solutions because there aren't any. Meaningful reform requires political consensus that doesn't exist. Crisis resolution requires leadership willing to make deeply unpopular decisions. Social cohesion requires communities willing to compromise on sacred principles. What I can tell you is this: the current path is unsustainable. The fiscal arithmetic doesn't work. The demographic patterns don't work. The political economy doesn't work. Something will have to give. The only question is whether it gives through managed transition or unmanaged collapse, through negotiated compromise or enforced settlement, through democratic renewal or authoritarian retrenchment. History suggests that countries in this situation rarely choose the hard reforms voluntarily. They wait until crisis forces change. They hope for external rescue. They pray for a technological breakthrough or resource discovery that solves the problem without requiring sacrifice. Sometimes they get lucky. Usually they don't. Israel's economic achievement has been built on extraordinary human capital, technological innovation, and remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. But even achievements have limits. And those limits are becoming visible in ways that should concern anyone who cares about democratic stability, regional security, or the fragility of social contracts under pressure. The demonstrators in Tel Aviv aren't calling for revolution. They're asking for a government that represents their interests, a military strategy that makes sense, an economy that rewards work, and a society where burden and benefit are shared fairly. These are not extreme demands. They are the basic expectations of democratic citizenship. The fact that 500,000 people feel compelled to take to the streets to make these demands tells you everything you need to know about how far the system has strayed from those expectations. As economists, we can model the fiscal trajectories, calculate the dependency ratios, project the growth curves, but we should never forget that behind every data point is a human decision, a family's choice, a community's cohesion or lack thereof. And right now, millions of those individual decisions are trending in a direction that should concern us all.